Hello, Susanna Lobez here, actor turned barrister turned broadcaster turned true crime writer, and proud member of Sisters in Crime Australia. Welcome to the Scarlet Stiletto Bites podcast. For over 30 years now, Sisters in Crime Australia has supported our women crime writers, both true crime and fiction, and some criminal literary talent has been unearthed. Among many awards, there's an annual prize for short crime fiction, the Scarlet Stiletto Awards. And for those of you who prefer your stories by ear, in 2023 we commenced this podcast series, Scarlet Stiletto Bites, to celebrate the Sisters' 30th anniversary. Each story is short, but not always sweet. Expect twisted tales, quirky humour, and a frisson of feminism. Please support us by following, sharing, reviewing, and generally spreading the word. We have no paywall. Trauma and sadness can steer people into a downward spiral into the dark, where values can evaporate and right gets mixed up with wrong, as in today's story, Out of the Dark by Anne Cost. Scarlet Stiletto 2011 Best Investigative Award and Late Starters Award. Annie awoke with a start. She reached for the bottle, but it was empty. Of course it was. Doom hung about her, good company for the pain that encircled her head. For a moment she was still in the dream, seeing again the hulking figure over her boy, sticking the needle into his arm. She dragged herself up into a sitting position and looked across at her young protege, where he slept in his corner of the squat, one arm draped childlike across his face. Benny, wake up! I had a dream about you, love. Even to her own ears her voice was cracked, rasping. Cheap whiskey will do that to you if you have enough of it. When Benny didn't answer, Annie crawled over to have a closer look, dreading what she might see. But his sweet young face looked peaceful enough, and Annie stroked the smooth young forehead. She shuddered. It was cold, cold as death. No! She pulled him into her arms and hugged him close, tears pouring down her dirty, wrinkled face. She rocked him back and forth, until old William, who'd been living in the squat forever, bawled from a heap of newspapers in the other corner. Give it up, old woman. Some of us here wants to sleep. It's my Benny, William. My Benny's dead. William dragged his cadaverous frame across the room and felt the boy. Been dead hours. Put him down, Annie. But Annie wouldn't relinquish her precious bundle and hit out at the old man. Annie, we'll have to call the police. Put him down now. I dreamed about it, William. I dreamed that someone stuck him with a needle and I didn't stop him. I thought it was a dream. Nah, you was as drunk as a skunk last night. You would have seen nothing. But I should have stopped him. Why didn't I stop him? I could have saved my boy. William was the one who walked to the phone box and called 000, and it was he who guided the police to where the boy was. Annie wasn't much help. She kept moaning that she should have saved her boy, and the two policemen wrinkled their noses and stepped away whenever she approached them. The coroner didn't take long to find the needle mark in Benny's arm and concluded it was one of the usual cases of drug overdose. Probably his first hit. I don't see any other marks on him, stupid kid. I'm sick of seeing these young lives wasted. Annie had ceased crying when the ambulance attendants came to remove Benny's body in the long black bag. Her eyes followed them to the door and she slumped on her pile of old blankets. This wasn't right. Benny would never have taken drugs of any kind. They talked about it often. "You shouldn't be drinking so much, Annie," he used to say to her. "It's no good for you. It's a drug too, you know. You're nice. You don't need to drink so much." And she'd tried, she really had. But then she'd need it so much that she couldn't think of anything else and would nearly crawl up the walls with the wanting of it. And Benny seemed to understand and would cover her with a blanket when she passed out. The squat felt empty without the boy's comforting presence, and Annie scratched about in her belongings for a few dollars so she could blot out the pain. Nothing left. William, feeling sorry for her, passed over his own bottle, but there wasn't much left in it, not enough to make a difference anyway. It was like losing her own boy again, her own little Tommy, run over by a drunk driver when he was only 5. Her marriage hadn't lasted long after that, too much pain, and she'd started drinking. Barry couldn't take it, and one day he just wasn't there. She'd lost her job, a good one as a private secretary, and now here she was, grieving all over again. Annie didn't believe that what she'd seen during the night had been a dream. If only she could nail the bastard. Benny was such a good kid. He didn't deserve to die like that. That terrible moment was etched in her memory, drunk though she'd been. There had been something familiar about the man. She hadn't seen him very clearly, only a side view, but there was something. She thought back to the long talks she had had with Benny. He spoke very well, as if he'd had a good education, but his story was enough to break a mother's heart. His stepfather had beaten his mother on a regular basis, and one day he picked up a golf club and hit her over the head. She was dead within minutes, but not before whispering, "You've got to leave, Ben, before he gets to you too." He made me help him put Mum's body in the car, Annie, and we drove up to our holiday house where Dad buried her in the golf club behind the shed. The boy hadn't been able to stop crying then, and Annie had held him until his sobs subsided. From then on, she looked after him, keeping those deadbeats away from him. Yeah, she still had a little something to reckon with when she wanted. "I'm going to get that shitbag, William. He's not going to get away with it." The old man laughed. "You looked in the mirror lately, Annie? Who's going to listen to you?" I'll go to the police. I'm a witness. I saw the bastard stick my Benny." "They won't listen. They said he was just another druggie." "Well, I'll go anyway. Someone's got to do something." William had been right. That lazy son of a bitch policeman told her that the case was closed, and when she demanded to see an inspector, he escorted her none too gently out of the station. "Go and sober up, old woman, and don't waste police time." What's the use, thought Annie, as she trudged slowly home. Just because I'm bloody homeless, it doesn't mean I'm stupid. I saw what I saw. Doesn't that count for something? When she told William what had happened, he nodded. He'd known what the police would say. Annie wasn't exactly a picture of respectability. It wouldn't be difficult to dismiss out of hand what she told them. "Lend us a couple of dollars, will you, William? I'll pay you back tomorrow when I pick up my pension." She bought a cheap bottle of whiskey at the cut-price supermarket and took it home. She felt justified in having another drink and slumped down on her blanket to drink herself into blessed oblivion. But instead she found that she kept looking into Benny's old corner. My poor little Benny. It's not bloody fair. It just didn't seem right that the police wouldn't dig into the circumstances of his death, not when she had information to tell them. Oh, what should I do, Benny, love? I can't let him get away with it, can I? She handed the whiskey bottle to William. Here, you take this, love. I owe you one from yesterday. She shuffled over to the corner where Benny had kept his few possessions. They were still there. A backpack, scuffed and dirty now, lay under a blanket with the coat he'd been wearing yesterday. She'd always respected his privacy, but now she looked at the bag closely. It was a Scotch college school bag. Gee, a fancy school like that. His family must have money to have sent him there. Inside were a few books, an empty notebook and some pens, but nothing significant. She ran her fingers through the pockets of his jacket and found a small photo. Annie didn't have any reading glasses, so she held it at arm's length and perused it carefully. A younger Benny and a pretty blonde woman, probably his mother. They looked happy together, but no stepfather. Never mind. This gave her something to work with. That night she had a terrible fit of the shakes, and if William hadn't drained the bottle first, she'd have wheedled it back from him. Something made her refrain from going out, though. She wanted to solve the mystery of Benny's murder and knew that if she didn't, nobody else cared enough to do it. So for most of the night she lay awake and thought about what she could do. Perhaps she should learn a bit more about Benny's past. She didn't even know his surname. In the morning she walked into the Salvos and asked for a food voucher and asked if she could get a shower anywhere. The woman behind the counter knew her and was happy to help. I want some better clothes too. Oh, that's great, Annie. Have a look through the shop and see what you'd like. After she had showered and changed into a smart, second-hand pantsuit, she looked a different woman. Oh, you look lovely, Annie. Here, let me do your hair for you a bit. Oh, you have lovely hair. Afterwards, she led Annie to a mirror, and she scarcely recognised herself. She looked quite respectable. Thanking the woman, she went out to buy some food and coffee, making an effort not to walk past the local pub. Her next objective was Benny's school, and she used her pensioner pass to take the tram. If she hadn't been so determined to avenge Benny, the sight of the grand school entrance would have deterred her, but she forced herself through the gate and up to the door marked "Office." "May I help you?" asked the smart young receptionist. Annie attempted to look confident and looked the woman straight in the eyes. I'm looking for my grandson, Ben." "What name, Mrs. Smythe?" answered Annie quickly. I don't know my grandson's surname, unfortunately, because his mother had remarried and Ben has taken his stepfather's name. But I have a photo of him here with my daughter-in-law." The young woman looked at the photo and said, "But that's Ben Tomlinson. Everyone's been looking for him for the last 6 months." She narrowed her eyes. "How come you didn't know that if you're his grandmother?" I've just returned from overseas. I haven't been able to raise anyone at home, and I thought I'd be able to contact Ben here." "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Smythe. Please take a seat and I'll ask the headmaster if he'll see you." Annie sat, wondering nervously if it was a good idea to talk to him. But he might shed some light on the mystery, so she decided to stay. Before long, a tall, grey-haired man in a conservative business suit shook Annie's hand. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Smythe. I wish we could be of more help to you. Jack Tomlinson has been in constant touch with us. It seems there was an argument at home, and Ben ran away. Has he contacted you at all?" No. I've just returned from a long trip overseas." "Oh, well, this is terrible. I love that boy. We've always been close, you know. Have you seen his mother? I've never met his stepfather, you see." No, I haven't. Jack said that she's too upset to see anyone. He's a good man, tries to spare her any extra grief." "That they moved from their last address, didn't they?" "I hadn't heard that, but you can contact Jack at work if you like. I'll find his card for you." Annie felt like skipping as she walked back down the driveway, but she made an effort to maintain her cover. "Well, that trip was worth it," she thought. "Now I'll be able to have a look at Mr. Jack Tomlinson." Looking at the card, Annie saw that Jack Tomlinson was a Member of Parliament and had his electoral office not far from her squat. The office was in a busy section of town, and Annie sat opposite the entrance and waited. It was close to 6 o'clock when a sleek black Fairlane pulled up outside, and the driver opened the door for Ben's stepfather. He turned side on to Annie as he climbed in, and she gasped. It was the same man she'd seen hovering over Benny. What she'd seen had been real, all right. Annie's hands started shaking again, and she knew that only a couple of drinks would steady her, but she also knew in her heart that if she had even one, she'd be incapable of doing anything. "Oh, I'm going to get you, you evil bastard," she muttered under her breath. On her way home, she called in at the police station again. She had much more to report now, but again she was rebuffed by the desk sergeant, even though she was now looking quite respectable. "If you won't let me talk to the inspector, I'll make a complaint to the police ombudsman," she warned him. The sergeant shrugged and told her to wait. Half an hour later she was ushered into Inspector Colin Mason's office, and he sat patiently as she explained what she had seen and heard. "So you see, Inspector, now we know that the boy's name is Ben Tomlinson, the boy whom his stepfather says is missing, and the man I saw in the squat looked like Mr. Tomlinson. So if Ben's story is true, shouldn't you follow that up?" "Oh, thank you so much for coming in, Annie. I'll certainly take your story into consideration. However, you must realise that Jack Tomlinson is a very important man and has been searching for his stepson for 6 months now. That doesn't seem to be the action of a killer, eh?" "But haven't you been listening to what Ben told me?" "Oh, boys make things up, Annie. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll have Mr. Tomlinson take a look at the boy's body. He'll be able to identify him if he is indeed his stepson." Annie's shoulders slumped as she walked home. This was not going the way she'd expected. She thought that Inspector Mason would at least have investigated her information. "I'm not going to let it rest, Benny. He deserves to go to jail for life for what he's done to you and your mother. Better still if someone would get rid of him for good." She walked slowly, thinking. "I wonder if I could get hold of a gun." She did have a few contacts on the street, working girls, kids who were dealing, even a few criminals. She'd ask around. But now she could barely lift her feet It had been a very long day, and if she didn't get some sleep, she'd be good for nothing. Next morning, she was sitting outside the electoral office again and decided to go inside and look around. Jack Tomlinson was standing near the receptionist, who was going over some papers on her desk. He looked up with a big smile. "Is there anything I can do for you, madam?" Yes, there is, as a matter of fact. When is your government going to do something about the homeless people in your electorate?" The man's smile remained fixed, but did she see a slight flicker of the eyes? Annie decided that she had, and gained a small measure of satisfaction from that. "And you are?" "Mrs. Annie Smythe." She decided to keep her assumed name. Perhaps it might force his hand if he'd been in touch with the school. "Well, Mrs. Smythe, my government is doing everything in its power to resolve the problem. It's not something that can be done overnight, and it's not in my portfolio, but I will certainly pass on your concerns to the appropriate minister." "That's all I can ask. Thank you, Mr. Tomlinson." For the rest of the day, Annie walked the streets, trying to find someone who would lend her a gun, but it wasn't easy. It appeared that she would have to come up with a sizable amount of cash before anyone would even talk about it. She'd had enough by evening and trudged home to confide in William. "Nothing's going the way I want, William." Let it rest, Annie. No one wants to listen to the likes of us, you know that." It would have been so easy to tell herself that she'd done the best she could. So tempting to get some whiskey and share it with William as they complained about the police, politicians, and life in general. But she remembered how it had been after Tommy's death. The driver had never been caught, and so there had been no resolution, no satisfaction that he or she had been punished or had even been sorry for what had happened. She'd become angry and bitter and filled with such grief that no one could console her. She'd started drinking so that she could get some sleep, and then it had escalated until she was having her first drink before breakfast. No, drinking wouldn't solve anything this time either. This time she would do something about it. Next morning, Annie was able to collect her pension and spoiled herself a little by splashing out on a McDonald's breakfast. As she ate, she watched the early news on the television and almost choked as she saw Jack Tomlinson being interviewed outside his office. Yes, there will be a challenge for the leadership," he was saying, "and I've been asked to put my name forward. I'm confident that I have the numbers, and I'm hoping to resurrect the government's popularity in the polls." The interviewer then turned to the camera and said that many people were confident that if he replaced the Prime Minister, the party would probably be returned in the coming election. You slimy bastard. Well, you won't succeed if I've got anything to say about it." Her self-enforced sobriety was getting to her, but every time she was tempted to walk into the pub or bottle shop, she made herself remember Benny's face and how he had looked as he lay, murdered by his own stepfather, and she resolved to find some way to make Jack Tomlinson suffer for what he did. She sat for a while on a park bench thinking, but didn't know what to do next. Discouraged, she trudged back to the squat where William was waiting. You had a very important visitor today, Annie. He said he was a lawyer and that one of your relatives has died and left you some money. Half your luck. He said he'd come back later." I don't have any relatives, William. I don't like this. I'm wondering if word got back to Jack Tomlinson that I was a witness to the murder. The police could have told him. They were going to ask him to identify Ben's body." I won't sleep here tonight. If he comes back, tell him I've gone to stay with my daughter for a few days. But you don't have a daughter. I know that, William, but I don't like this. I'm going to play it safe. Annie picked up Benny's meagre possessions and rolled them up in a blanket, gave William a thumbs up and took herself off to the run-down shops opposite their squat. The shops were either closed or abandoned now, and she curled up on the blanket in a position where she could watch the entrance to the squat. It wasn't too uncomfortable, and soon she dozed off. She woke with a start. Something was happening. Rolling slowly onto her side, she watched a man dressed in shabby clothing walk slowly up to her squat. It's him, she thought. His gait was too confident for a man needing somewhere to stay for the night, and his shoes were too modern, too shiny. She caught a brief glimpse of his familiar profile. Annie remained where she lay, still and silent, but she felt her stomach tighten with fear. He wants to kill me too. He sees me as a threat. Annie had to wait for 20 minutes before he emerged, and she remained where she was for another half hour before she dared get up and go inside. She crept in quietly and approached William. William, are you awake? He came back. Did you see him? But her old friend had nothing to say to her. William was dead. There were no outward signs that he had been murdered, but his pillow was lying beside him, and Annie knew that it would have been an easy matter to smother an old man who had been drinking. Oh, William, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't want this to happen. I promise you that I'll get him. I'll get him for you and for Benny. Annie was now beyond fear, beyond pain, but she vowed on the soul of her son Tommy that she would stop this evil man. And as she sat there, looking at but not really seeing William, she wondered how she could stop this horrible, powerful man. In the morning she covered William with his blanket, but decided to do nothing else about his body for the moment. She had said that she wouldn't be there for a few days and didn't want to give her position away. She had a McDonald's breakfast and bought a newspaper so she'd look like other morning customers. The front page sported a photo of a smiling Jack Tomlinson with all the details of his challenge for the leadership. As Annie looked at it, an idea struck her. It was brilliant. She laughed aloud, and the man at the next table looked at her, a question in his eyes. Annie smiled back and pointed to the paper. He nodded with a smile and returned to his own. She drained her coffee and walked outside. She couldn't wait to get started. At the local post office, she bought a small USB key, 2 envelopes and stamps, and as soon as the internet cafe opened, she sat down at one of the computers. She began to type. Leader of the Opposition, Parliament House, Canberra. She wrote down the story of Ben's murder and how she had been a witness. She wrote Ben's tale of his mother's assault and eventual murder, and the position of her body and the golf club that Jack Tomlinson had used to kill her. How the MP had been trying to find the boy before Ben told anyone what he had witnessed. She explained that although she had gone to the police, they had not taken her seriously, and as she didn't want to have a murderer as a Prime Minister, she was telling them now. My story can be verified by seeing if there is indeed a body buried at Mr. Tomlinson's country estate, she wrote. She also suggested that perhaps the news media might be interested in investigating the truth of her testimony. At the bottom, she typed her name, Mrs. Anne Rockman, and her address, and below that, CC Prime Minister. There, I haven't quite lost all my old skills. She copied the letter onto the key and asked if she would be able to use the shop's printer. She signed both letters and put them in the stamped, addressed envelopes. Annie decided that she'd earned another cup of coffee. She looked at the letters with satisfaction as she drank. She thought about Benny, about William. She walked out with her head held high and a spring in her step, and she posted the letters. The end. Thanks so much for listening. We'd love to get your feedback and we'd love to reach more listeners. Our website is sistersincrime.org.au and our email address is admin@sistersincrime.org.au. Until next Friday then, when we bring you another scintillating story from Australian women crime creative.